Hi, Daniel.
Hi, Bob.
How you
How
doing?
are you?
I'm
Good.
good. Thank you for joining us again.
Good to be here.
Some of our viewers and listeners may remember you. You are Daniel Ingram. I'm Robert Wright. This is the Wright Show. And you've been with us before. When we spoke about not just Buddhism, but about actual enlightenment, being enlightened, which you profess to be. And far be it from me to doubt you. You are the author of Mastering the Core Teachings of the Buddha, an unusually hardcore Dharma book. And then on the title page it says, by the interdependent universe. That's a reference to Buddhist philosophy that I think we'll get to in case. And I mean, it's a little bit of a joke, obviously, but it has some Buddhism in it. And not facile Buddhism, actually. I mean, this is a serious... It's a serious thing. The interdependent universe, but conventionally attributed to the Arhat. Daniel M. Ingram. Arhat is a word that means an awakened one, an enlightened one. Far be it from me to judge who is and is not enlightened. I will say I'm convinced that, I've talked to a lot of serious meditators. There's no doubt you have reached a depth of contemplative being that, say, I, for example, have not reached. And if people want to know what that's like, what it's like to be you, they can refer to the last thing that we did. I don't want to spend a whole lot of time on that, except to say it's better than the way I am. If I could do it, I'd do it. And one thing that's interesting, and this you have in common with Gary Weber, whom I've also interviewed, is that there was kind of a break. You worked very hard meditatively for a long, long time, and then there was kind of a zone you got to, and once you got to that zone, it wasn't so hard to maintain. It wasn't like you had to keep meditating 2 hours a day or anything. And so I envy you. I aspire to be you. You are my role model.
No, you should aspire to be you, just the best you can be from a sensate clarity point of view.
Oh, I didn't realize that was the goal. Well, I can certainly be better than I am. That's easy. It's being you that's hard. Okay, so anyway, what I want to talk about this time is the path to enlightenment. I mean, one point you make in your book, Mastering the Core Teachings of the Buddha, is that actually there's a surprising amount of consensus among people who either, who have arguably attained enlightenment / awakening, or at least gotten it somewhere near there, a remarkable amount of consensus on the path that got them there, and the series of kind of realizations, the series of meditative experiences. I mean, a certain amount of variation, but there's also some things that they have in common, and this goes back hundreds and hundreds of years.
Thousands.
Thousands, you might, a couple of thousand. I mean, but there's a text. What is the thing by Buddha Gosa in the 5th century?
Visuddhimagga.
Yeah, right. That sketches it out, the path of purification. Now, so I want to talk about this path, partly because I want to talk about some of the early stages that might be more accessible to some of our listeners and viewers than maybe some of the later stages, at least in the near term. And the way I want to start out is the following. You use the word insight a lot in your book. One place meditators may encounter that is as a translation of the word vipassana, which is a school of meditation that goes way, way back. And the thing about vipassana is I think it's easy to confuse these days, at least in the United States, easy to confuse with the word mindfulness. I mean, I think a lot of times people might come back and go, oh, I just went to a mindfulness meditation retreat. And if you actually looked at the place they went to, technically it would be a vipassana retreat center. And in ancient Buddhist terminology, vipassana and mindfulness are not the same thing. But so how do you distinguish? What would you say about mindfulness as opposed to insight?
Well, mindfulness. So if I start with sort of Theravadan theory, mindfulness would be one of the 7 factors of awakening or enlightenment, and it's the first of them, and there are 6 more. And so the second would be investigation of the Dharma or the truth or sensate reality, which actually often is incorporated into mindfulness practices, as they call themselves. And mindfulness, in some ways, was clearly a way to rebrand something that is explicitly Buddhist as something that might be more secular, if that makes sense. Mm-hmm. But from a certain point of view, there's nothing particularly Buddhist about just being clear about what's going on in your sensate world. That's a natural human thing to do. It's not, doesn't have to be Buddhist.
And that's what you're saying mindfulness is, just clear awareness unclouded by certain things that normally cloud clear awareness?
Well, so mindfulness gets defined a lot of different ways by different schools of mindfulness even. So you wouldn't even get to different mindfulness teachers to always necessarily agree on all the fine particulars, but the basic points remain. You're talking about sitting down or walking or whatever position you're in, noticing what's going on, noticing thoughts as thoughts, noticing physical sensations as physical sensations, noticing emotions as emotions. And then the question is, what do you do with those? So some will emphasize more about a sort of a more relative work, non-judgmental approach to just seeing your feelings come up or your breath or whatever it is. And some will be more technical, noticing lots of little sensations. Some will have different emphases, like being mindfulness of breathing or being mindfulness of how you're feeling. Being mindful of how you're feeling. Or, they'll have various sort of different things. So it's not like mindfulness itself is a totally homogeneous movement. It isn't. And mindfulness historically clearly came out of both Zen and the Theravada more specifically, but has other influences as well. But a lot of its influences are places of convergence. So it very much in some ways tried to be a sort of a convergent synthesizer where it said, okay, what are the key elements that we find in a lot of different basic essential meditation practices, and how can we strip that down to something we can package for a clinical context or for a psychotherapeutic context or for a mainstream meditation context, which are all good things from a certain point of view. That said, the mindfulness movement also sometimes might reasonably be pointed out to have stripped out a lot of the sort of more advanced technologies of some of those practices and traditions when they simplified things. So, but when you're trying to simplify stuff, that's what happens. So it's okay from a certain point of view. But there's a lot more to it. So, and so Vipassana, which has its foundations in 6 sense doors, 3 characteristics, 4 foundations of mindfulness, that has obviously a tremendous amount of overlap with, mindfulness, sort of modern secular mindfulness traditions.
Okay.
But Vipassana, from another point of view, is vastly more technical, does have much higher standards, advocates for, much more advanced stages of mastery and practice, and has a whole lot of theory to help with that, stages of insight, maps, and all that stuff.
Okay, so before we get into Vipassana per se, what did you say is the relationship between mindfulness and investigation?
So again, and this sort of depends on the teacher and the tradition, because it's not like mindfulness is a homogeneous entity. It isn't, right? So, John Kabat-Zinn stuff, the MBSR stuff would look a little bit different from some other mindfulness teachers, would look a little bit different from, some of the people who might teach at IMS, or some of the people
and all of those
all of those look a little different from each other in terms of their
if you read the oldest
their backgrounds and, all that stuff.
And if you read the oldest Buddhist texts that have the word that's been translated as mindfulness in them, kind of the closest thing to like a ancient Bible of mindfulness or something, you would find something different still. That wouldn't seem exactly like what any of these people are saying, probably, even though there's a connection.
True enough.
So
even Vipassana, as it comes down to us, is a widely, variable and rich and nuanced tradition with lots of different strains. So, like, if you, sat on a Goenka retreat, it would look different from Mahasi retreat. They're both clearly in the general big camp of Vipassana, but they have different methods, different emphases, while some strong commonalities as well. 6 sense doors, 3 characteristics, and a high degree of, developmental skill.
And maybe to give people a sense, who have not done any mindfulness meditation, like in just a difference in technique, as I gathered at the Goenka retreats, and those are available in the United States, in Shelburne, Massachusetts.
Lots of places actually around the world. Many places these are offered.
Goenka you will only see on video at the Moped. Is he still alive? I don't know. But in any event, the technique there is to focus awareness on various parts of your body in succession, whereas an alternative common technique is to focus on your breath. That's just to give, both of those things qualify as a way to get into mindfulness, but that's an example of a difference of technique. So anyway, investigate. Well, sorry.
So actually have not been in a Goenka retreat. Lots of my friends have. My mom's had about 20 of them, and like lots of my friends have done these. They're very, very common, but actually think they spend about the first 3 days building up sort of more concentration-y sorts of practices often, and then we'll go to more body sweeping.
So they do breathing before the body scan?
Anyway, I haven't been on one of these retreats for those Goenka people in the audience, but I think they spend about the first 3 days more building up, more anapanasati practices, and then sort of go breathing. Off. But anyway,
okay, that's okay. So then what I should say is that there are mindfulness and Vipassana places like Insight Meditation Society in Barre, Massachusetts, where they don't get much into this body scanning thing that they do at the Going to retreats. Anyway, there are differences. I mean, not in any of the
some people do. So there's lots of different teachers that come there. And actually, their 3-month retreat initially used to do more body scanning sorts of practices. They then later switched to noting practices. But there are different teachers who teach different styles. There are a wide range of styles. So I can't be certain I know of the range and how many of them are how influenced by Goenka. But anyway.
Okay. So just quickly then on investigation, a little more on investigation. Is mindfulness prepares the way for investigation?
So, from a sort of so I'll just talk sort of from my point of view. You have to understand what your basic objects are. So here's a thought. If you can't recognize a thought as a thought, as an experience, you're not going to be able to investigate. Here's the breath. You have to be able to notice there's the breath. Mm-hmm. There's another breath. There's the body. There's a feeling. There's, a cold, the sense of air on the skin, or there's warmth, there's movement, there's fluidity, there's the mind moving around, there's the mind being more still, there's the mind being clear, there's the mind not being as clear. So you have to get some basic ability to notice these are the building blocks of your experience before you can really finally investigate them. And so the initial development is proceeding with the skill set to actually notice what's going on. And most people, weirdly enough, even though they may be very successful, smart, intelligent people, when they first sit down on the cushion, notice that, in fact, that's not so easy, right? It's not so easy. The mind is restless. It jumps around. It gets lost in thought mostly. It may obsess about a certain painful sensation and miss lots of other sensations around it. Or get lost in a daydream or, be thinking about, life or issues. And you'll find that it takes a while to learn to just get enough sort of meta cognitive awareness of what the mind is doing, and then what the objects of the mind are as sensate phenomena as they arise one by one. And so that takes that sort of mindfulness, which would be the first of the factors of awakening, is a crucial foundation for later investigation, where one begins to notice, okay, wait, how fast are these sensations oscillating back and forth? When did those sensations begin and end? Exactly what were they? How did they change? How did they shift? How fast were they? What did they feel like? What were there other components that I may have missed from a sensate point of view? What did that thought sound like? What did it look like? What did it, what really is that pain? Where is it? How often is it there? Where are its edges? Is it as strong a sensation as I think it is? What are the other sensations of the room? What are the sensations of space like, or visual sensations? How much of my thoughts are visual versus my actual experience being visual? Do I confuse those two? Can I notice each of those little things? So we begin from a basic platform of the ability to notice what's going on in our sensate experience, and then we start to notice things about those things that are going on once we start to get enough awareness to actually notice that, here's our sensate world, and we can actually sort of get out of our thoughts and issues and our other things that may be distracting us, our doubt, our boredom, our restlessness, or whatever, and actually start to focus on, okay, here's the 6 sense doors, and here's what are rising in them, and we can see those as objects.
Right.
And then that's the foundation for investigation of things like impermanence or suffering or no self, or however you want to frame your conceptions.
So now those 3 things you just mentioned are that you didn't select them randomly. Those are called the 3 marks of existence. You call them the characteristics in your book, and these are fundamental. I mean, if the question is, okay, well, once you're noticing things and investigating things, what's really important to investigate and notice? These 3 things, according to Buddhist philosophy, would rank up there very high. They are said to pervade reality, right? These 3 traits: impermanence, not self, which is tricky because it can apply to you, but it can also, especially in the Mahayana tradition, maybe more explicitly, but it can also apply to anything you're seeing. That tree lacks a self and so on. And then there's dukkha, which is commonly translated as suffering. And maybe we should start with that. I want to talk about all 3 because these are important parts of the path, right? Your apprehension of these is very important parts of the path. And I think the one that people have least trouble with, at least at first, is impermanence, because nobody claims that everything lasts forever. So let's save that for last, even if the meditative apprehension of impermanence goes beyond the observation that I just made. Dukkha, or often translated suffering, I think people tend to resist the idea even that that it pervades everything in the universe, or even that it characterizes every moment of their own existence, right? So what does it mean to say that this dukkha thing is everywhere all the time?
Okay, so I should reframe this, because one of the core assumptions of vipassana is somewhat solipsistic, meaning that grand frameworks of things existing when you're not looking at them, or object permanence that children learn, like they look at something and they close their eyes and then they look again and it's still there, or you can hide a cup behind a pillow and they can reach behind it and find the cup, they know it's still there. You have to kind of throw those out from just when working with vipassana. And so the first important thing is to frame things in terms of vipassana is concerned with what is in one's experience now, and not concerned with broad questions of object permanence in the relative sense. So that's sort of the first important thing to say. So in your own experience, as you actually sit there, what you're experiencing in that moment is the material and the concern and the scope of the frameworks of the theory of vipassana. That's very important, because otherwise, you can get into sort of down bigger philosophical tracks that are not as helpful for practice. Mm-hmm. And so in terms of suffering, so nearly everybody who's ever tried to meditate notices something about suffering, right? So it's a funny thing that people reject this, when yet it's usually one of the more predominant aspects of their practice, as anybody who has ever tried to sit knows, right? I mean, you can't miss it from a certain point of view. Sit for an hour and see how it went. You're going to go, was that a really good time? For most people, no.
So you mean for example, a beginner who's told to sit down, like focus on the breath or something, like almost immediately they feel they would rather be somewhere else doing something else, right? Yeah.
And for very obvious reasons. Like, it's not necessarily pleasant to just sit there with your own mind and your own body.
Right.
And so it's funny to reject suffering when it's so glaringly obvious. In fact, it's the most obvious of the three. It's just something we don't like, which is also understandable. It's not surprising that we don't like suffering. Who would like suffering, right? That's the whole point. And so it's a funny thing to reject when even a few minutes of meditation makes it glaringly obvious. So that's point number one.
Yeah, well, go ahead. Can I just interject? I mean, what the version most people reject would be that, wait, I'm not always suffering. But I think one thing you might argue to them, and they might become more aware of it, meditation, is that actually ordinary human motivation, like feeling you should go do this now, go do that then, involves lots of times where if you pay really close attention, what you'll find is you're unhappy with your current situation. You want something else.
Or you're afraid of the unhappiness that you're about to run into, and so you do something to prevent that.
Something else. So there's a lot of aversion, and there's a lot of... and in fact, an alternative translation or supplementary translation of the word dukkha is unsatisfactoriness. So anyway, meditation may help convince people that actually, if they really pay close attention to what's going on, there are more times in their life than they realize when they're really not at ease with the way things are. That's almost the human condition. That's part of the philosophical claim here, right?
Oh, yes, absolutely. But it's more than that. So if we suddenly go from I've been talking sort of very relative sort of beginner terms, I'm going to suddenly wax to the far end of the spectrum, and then we can maybe sort of like define the range of the thing and kind of move up and down it. So moving to the very far end of the spectrum, there's this sense I am. Mm-hmm. And that sense I am is recreated again and again from a changing field of phenomena. And we recreated the sensations that arise here, and then here, and then here, and then here, and then there, and then thoughts, and then images, and all this stuff. So there's this moving thing of lots of sensations that are sort of co-opted into being part of a sense of a coherent self, despite the fact that nothing like this sort of sensate stability is there. But the mind is constantly trying to say, okay, this sensation here is me, this sensation here is me, this sensation here is me. And then it's also simultaneously with doing that trying to keep a distance from all these things as well, so which is weird, right? It's trying to say, this is me, but I'm over here watching. This is me, but I'm over here watching it. That's actually taking up an incredible amount of mind processing time, right? Sometimes we seem to be our nose. Sometimes we're watching our nose. Sometimes we seem to be our thoughts. Sometimes we're watching our thoughts. Sometimes we seem to be the back of our head. Sometimes we're watching the back of our head. And that process, it's almost like a virus running on the computer that slows it down and causes all kinds of problems, it is a habit that doesn't need to be there. It doesn't need to be there.
Now, you're referring to the habit. You're referring to the habit of identifying with all of these things.
Right. It doesn't need to be there, and it turns out the fact of it being there is intrinsically very painful. It's like a subtle background nausea sometimes, and other times it's really quite oppressively painful. And so its degree to which it's obviously causing a whole lot of trouble changes, right? So it's not like it's a uniform, fixed characteristic. This is the level of suffering, and it's always exactly that level. No, our experience of how painful it is changes a lot. And sometimes there's a reasonable amount of pleasant sensations that, like, so if like, here's the scale of, lots of really obvious suffering based on this and very subtle obvious suffering based on this. Sometimes also in our sensate experience is something very pleasant, right? So there might be this level of baseline suffering based on this weird process of identification, and there might be a whole lot of pleasure sometimes. And we remember those moments and sort of pick them out and go, okay, if I can get the pleasure high enough, or if I can ignore this enough somehow, then maybe like I'll figure out a way to stay that way, which doesn't work, as we all know, right? So you only have to, spend a few minutes thinking about that to realize that strategy is not going to work, but it's the one we generally pursue. And it's not like it's a totally crazy strategy. It's not like I don't like pleasure over pain. I do. And it's not like, I think that people shouldn't try to be happy. They obviously should in relative means, right? You should take care of yourself and all that stuff. So it's okay. But ignoring this baseline level of pain that is sort of this variable moving target, is a problem, because a lot of the time, this is actually higher than the background level of pleasure. Pleasure is relatively fleeting, as anybody who really seriously looks at the question knows. And strong pleasure, it's very, very hard to sustain, right? Even people who go to sort of more extreme measures like shooting heroin or whatever, they rapidly realize, oh, wait, the amount of pleasure I get from this is, rapidly diminishing, and the amount of suffering
they're just encountering the same. Right? So, they're encountering the same aspect of pursuing pleasure that we all encounter in ordinary life. It's just built into the human system by and large.
Right, but you can actually eliminate that suffering based on identification. You can actually, if you get your sensate clarity high enough and your careful investigation of what's going on enough, you can actually eliminate layers of that, usually in stages. The rare case of spontaneous complete awakening or whatever being the rare exception, possibly. It's a topic I don't want to go into. But for most people, they eliminate it in stages. They start to notice, oh, wait, hold on. As I practice, I start to recognize, wait, there's something going on in identification, and some of it may start to drop away. So they start to go, oh, wait.
Can you give us one concrete example of that for beginners? A concrete example of that? So, like, what's the kind of thing where their mind might be doing and they'd go, oh, that's not conducive to happiness and it's not necessary?
Right. So one of the most common early insights is a stage called mind and body. And that's usually one of the first pleasant ones. So there are some stages of insight that are pleasant, some that are unpleasant, and they sort of tend to go in this order of pleasant, unpleasant, pleasant, unpleasant, pleasant, unpleasant. So weirdly enough, the progress of meditative practice is not all, one linear thing going up towards more and more enjoyable, pleasant, etc. Instead, one of the most initial things that people notice is all of a sudden, when they get their concentration and their mindfulness strong enough and are able to investigate well enough, that all of a sudden thoughts split out from being the sense of like being caught in them or being in them, like, or being like, sort of like this cloud of mosquitoes that we're sort of stuck in. All of a sudden, boom, there's a thought. And they can actually recognize, wow, that's a thought. I can look at that thought and I'm not so caught in it. I'm not so like stuck in it. I can actually go, oh, wait, that was just a fear. Oh, wait, that was just sadness. Maybe I just need to feel that sadness. Oh, wait, maybe that was anger. But it's not like, it doesn't have this immediate sense of like wrapping their whole head in this cocoon of contracted emotion. And so that is actually very pleasant. Like, so it's an early insight that a lot of people will have. And once they've had that insight, they go, oh, that was cool. Like, some people really recognize it and go, wow, suddenly I wasn't so caught in that thing I was thinking a lot about. And that's an important insight. And so it's a beginner insight, and it's a good foundation, because once you're not so caught up in thoughts, you can actually start to see thoughts as experiences, and you go, okay, that was an experience. Wait, that thought is more of an auditory thought. That thought's more of a visual thought. That thought's whoa, what is that? How am I experiencing that thought? And thought becomes more a part of the field of experience that can clearly start to be known from a sensate point of view, rather than like me or I or mine or this tight thing in my brain. And so that's a very early insight that a lot of people go, oh, wow, that's really valuable. And is a reason that a lot of people start, down a more meditative path formally when they start to see that and go, okay, that's cool.
Right. Yeah. But here's a question about that. Like, I'm familiar with like being in a meditation retreat and a thought arises and you kind of in a sense observe it, although I'm not that great at that. But anyway, that will probably be the end of the train of thought because now you're thinking about the thought, right? That train of thought will probably not continue. I mean, my question for you is, does your ordinary thinking go on, the thinking that gets you through life and gets you to, arrange for things to happen and all the thinking you need to do? You're a physician, you're an emergency room physician, all the thinking you need to do, does that kind of go on for you in a totally different way? You are less identified with the thoughts on a moment-by-moment basis.
Well, so you raised a bunch of different points in there, so maybe I'm gonna try to tease out a few of them. The first point about an emergency medicine doctor, I'm not sure where I'm hanging on that one. As I say to people who are training, initially you spend a lot of time thinking. So like when I'm training residents and medical students, you think a lot. You think linearly about differentials. Okay, they have chest pain. That could be a heart attack. That could be pneumonia. That could be a musculoskeletal thing. That could be a blood clot. That could be, inflammation. That could be cancer. That could be all kinds of stuff. Later on, you stop doing that in that kind of way. So this initial linear thinking in any profession, this is true of all kinds of professions. So do I formally think much in clinical practice? It's a strange thing to say, but no, like it's mostly reflexive. It's some sort of reflexive pattern recognition that presents a series of steps and actions without having to have gone through some long, elaborate process. But that's true of any technical skill that you're learning, right? So like a skilled carpenter wouldn't be thinking, okay, I need to pick up this chisel because if I use this specific chisel, then I can get that angle. No, they just grab the chisel and do what they do. Do you see what I mean?
But when a novel situation arises, they may need to actually...
Right, they may need to actually think a little bit. Like when an unusually complicated patient arises, I have to go, okay, wait, I have to turn my linear brain on again and do that. And that's the same of, I think, any profession, right? So, and commonly reported. So that's the first point. When working in an ER, it's mostly reflexive and intuitive more than cognitive, past a certain point. And that's just part of any profession, I think, and spending more time in it. But in terms of my life, like the living experience, it turns out you don't need to think nearly as much as you think you do. And in fact, which sounds like a strange thing to say, as I make a joke all the time in the ER. See, people start thinking, they get ideas. And that's where most people run into trouble. See, you think about it every time somebody got into trouble because they had an idea.
Maybe you should tell people where you live right now. What state you live in?
I live in Alabama. So
okay.
We have fun with that. So anyway, great people down here, but sometimes those sorts of comments have a certain humorous aspect to them anyway. So, but the point remains. So the point remains that most of our thoughts are not helping us that much. And so to try to stop thinking is obviously sort of a fool's errand, right? That's the thought about not thinking. And then you can sort of spiral into these patterns of, oh, I'm bad for thinking, or I shouldn't be thinking, or, I don't want to cause any of that stuff, really, because the practical thing that actually leads to a somewhat better relationship to thoughts and a somewhat better functioning of thoughts, and exactly how far you can take that, Robert Wright and I have what am I thinking? Gary Weber. I'm sorry, my brain and names flips names.
A lot of people get me and Gary mixed up because we're both enlightened. So don't worry.
Yes, absolutely. So,
right.
My brain flips names all the time. It's part of my pathology. Anyway, so Gary Weber and I would debate exactly all the fine points of that. But the general trend of more practice leading to some much better relationship to thought is widely reported. Mm-hmm. So that's So we can get into the fine points. But something about just being really immersed in sights, in sounds, in the body, and stuff that sort of changes the relationship to thought. Whereas a lot of the time, if we're not well trained to be in the body or in this room or in this physical space or in these sounds or in these tastes or in these smells or whatever it is, then we may spend a lot of time kind of having tuned out most of the physical realm and lost in thought, which sometimes might be very skillful, but a lot of the time is kind of pathological, sort of the default mode network, as it's becoming called in neuroscience circles, is pretty uncomfortable. Like it's dysphoric.
It's basically the part of the brain associated with a wandering mind. Just kind of, you're not really focused on some goal. Your mind is drifting from thought to thought. Now tell me this. I mean, maybe. So you're saying, for one thing, there's just less thought in a certain sense, and it seems to me maybe that the connection of that to the question I originally asked, one connection could be that the kind of thoughts that you're not having anymore are the kind of thoughts that you do tend to like grasp after. You know what I mean? It's like say revenge fantasies. Say you're thinking of some enemy, and I mean, I hope you're not going to tell me that the 8 to 9 hours a day I spend on revenge fantasies are not well spent, Daniel. But in any event,
it's hard to. I don't know. Like,
but in any event,
somewhere have you managed to achieve proper revenge? I'm just kidding. Sorry.
All my enemies. Let's just say that none of my enemies have been heard from lately. Okay. No, but seriously, those are the kind of thoughts that would, I assume, not be part of an arahat's everyday experience, and those are the kinds of thoughts that you really cling to. Whereas the kind of thought like, oh, this is a novel situation, how do I deal with this? That's a thought that you almost, by nature of the thought, you have a slightly more distant relationship to it, right?
Well, so distant. So there's a bunch of stuff in there, right? There's a bunch of different points in there. So distance. The sense of distance can start to fall away. So as more and more this field just takes over, the sense that I'm here and that's a thing there, unless there's some distance relationship, starts to dissolve out into just there's a whole bunch of stuff going on, right? There's physical sensations and sights and sounds and thoughts, but it starts to become more of a space. And in this space, a lot of stuff is happening, right? So in this, of which one component is thought.
Right.
But when you shift to that sort of more open, immediately grounded in this sort of integrated sense reality point of view, there is much more an experiential, direct noticing. Thoughts are this very, very subtle, transient part of this whole thing, right? So, like, what if I was to sort of have a volumeometer that could read the volume of all of the components of this moment of experience, what percentage of that would thought be? I don't know, 0.5% or something. It's a very teeny part. There's all these There's all these sights. There's all these sounds. There's this whole body. There's, the images on the screen, and then there's space. And by the way, of that thought is this really teeny, ephemeral little bit of moving, sort of energetic, sensate quality stuff, that as a proportion of experience it's not trivial, because it's not like thought is trivial, but in terms of the experience of it is really a teeny component. And that groundedness just through practice, right? So again, I care about practice. I care about how you or somebody can do this. That repetition of just re-embodying this space, this moment, starts to tip that balance. Whereas before, we may find ourselves a lot of the time very much having thought being a gigantic part of our experience, our gigantic, very huge part of what's going on with us. We can start to, through practice of remembering, there's a body in which thought is happening, or there's a space in which thought is happening, there's a room in which thought is happening, there's also smells and tastes and all this other sensate information coming in, and we start to notice thoughts actually as experiences. We notice they're a really small part of this whole thing, and that in and of itself is extremely valuable in terms of how it changes the relationship to those experiences, because they're not nearly the huge part of our sensate universe that they used to be.
Okay.
So is that helpful?
Yeah, it is. And so like before moving on to a second character, a second mark of existence of the three, let's just cap this. So we were talking about dukkha, suffering, unsatisfactoriness, and the general idea is, or a general idea is, that even if you resist the idea that your whole life is suffering, if you really pay attention to your relationship to the world and to your thoughts and everything, you'll find at a really fine-grained level, and this is what meditation is partly about, is observing things you would not normally notice at a very fine-grained level. And the idea is you will notice that actually a lot of your life, if you pay enough attention, is like being not quite happy with where you are. wanting something you don't have, not wanting something you do have, wanting to get away from some thought or some feeling, and so that's that's
a key portion of suffering, right? And that sense of creating a sense of moving identity in a changing world and constantly having to keep that up is just a very painful brain process.
And it eats up a lot of energy, right? It
eats up a tremendous amount of energy and brain processing power, and you get a lot of processing power back the more you through clarity and through good practice and just rewiring the system. You get a lot of that processing power back.
And Gary Weber, again, who I would put in roughly your league. He talks about how after this happened, he entered this new state. He went to a meeting at his job, and he was just so much more kind of a fish. He was so focused. He was totally present in the meeting. And let me just tell a story. He came and talked. I taught here at Princeton a couple of years. I taught a freshman seminar called Science and Buddhism, and he came in and talked to the class 2 consecutive years. And when he came in the second year, we were comparing, after the class, the kinds of questions they asked to the last class, and he could remember better than I could. I mean, where he would say, oh, there's a really sharp kid who sat here last year, like right over here. And I was like, wait, which kid was that? And I had taught these kids 12 weeks in a row, and he had only been there once. And he was remembering things about the location of particular kinds of students. So anyway, this is evidence that maybe there is something to be gained in terms of focus and clarity.
The memory question is sort of an interesting one, and actually gets debated a lot in my social circles. Memory in some ways becomes better, in some ways becomes worse. That sounds like a really weird thing to say. It becomes better because of the sensate clarity phenomena you're mentioning, right? There is more sense of presence, less sense of distraction, less sense of being caught in one's thoughts. But there is also less, the emotional models are very complicated, but it's widely reported, there's less emotional charge to stuff. And it's emotional charge to things that burns memories in.
That's right.
So people notice both effects, and it's not entirely predictable at any one moment which effect will be stronger, right? The immediate sensate clarity, presence, and lack of distractionness, or the fact that it's all just changing and it doesn't have the adrenaline and the norepi or the whatever chemicals that like burn memories hard into the brain because they have some emotional charge to them. There's clearly a connection between emotional charge and stronger memories.
Right.
So those are sort of competing factors, and when me and my friends get to debate the memory question, those are common.
I mean, I might guess that it's a relative. It's a question of relative affective strength. And so if your affect is more subdued generally, you'll still remember as many things. But anyway, we shouldn't get off on this. Let's move to another characteristic of existence. Let's do impermanence, of the 3. So we've done dukkha. Let's do impermanence. What's the Pali word? Is that anicca or is that no? It's a.
So dukkha, anicca, anatta. So
anicca is permanence. It is impermanence.
Yeah.
Okay, so the conventional in the conventional story of the Buddha 101, like you hear, he went out and he saw there's suffering and so on, and he finally figures out that nothing lasts forever. People die. If you're too attached to these things, that will lead to trouble. You have to accept the impermanence of things. So that's a common rendering of the story. And there's truth to that, of course. There's nothing. Right. No pleasure is going to last forever, and yet we do kind of delude ourselves into anticipating pleasures as if they were going to last longer than they are. So there is that. But I assume that the meditative apprehension of impermanence, there's also a more fine-grained apprehension of impermanence than those kinds of things, right?
Right. So if you go a bit solipsistic with it, or you just go empiricist about it. So like an empiricist really who would take, I'm talking like British empiricism, like Hume or whatever. If you take empiricism to its extreme, right, which means the only things that exist in my universe at this time are the actual sensate qualities that are arising. That's sort of the frame in which vipassana and the concept of impermanence makes the most sense. And so, and is the most useful. I don't want to debate questions of grander philosophy, but in terms of practice, if you're actually trying to change your brain in some of these specific ways that the brain can be changed, that's a great frame when doing vipassana, if that makes sense. So,
and by the way, David Hume, in his introspections, came to some conclusions. He's a British empiricist that were very Buddhist. We won't get off on that.
Yes, I totally agree.
Right.
Yeah. But that grounding and the immediacy of just what's going on is a core vipassana point. And if you notice, if you just ignore, sort of more abstract questions of object permanence and all that, as a kid would learn, and stick with empirical permanence, anybody sitting on a cushion will notice that there's like all this stuff coming in really fast, and it's like, that's how it's gone, and there's pain, and there's like this, and the mind moves, and it shifts. It's like, what's weird is that in the face of what's so obviously an initial chaotic experience for most people sitting down on a cushion, that they would somehow reject the concept of impermanence when it's what most people are then overwhelmed by. Do you see what I mean? It's just, weirdly enough, it's a question of taking that even farther until you're so overwhelmed that the identity process becomes short-circuited, because it can no longer possibly maintain that in the face of the sensate clarity about the straightforward and obvious fact of impermanence, right? So essentially nobody sits down on the cushion and has a perfectly static experience.
Right.
Right? So, and particularly no beginners sit on the cushion and have a particularly static experience. They have a chaotic experience. That chaos is the point. That, weirdly enough, is what you're looking for. And then you get into this weird thing where people get this paradigmatic or practical conflict between they think they're supposed to make the breath this stable thing, or they think they're supposed to make the mind totally silent, or they think they're trying to stabilize attention, when from a Vipassana point of view, you're trying to do the exact reverse. You're trying to destabilize the experience of everything, or you might say recognize the intrinsically unstable experience of everything, sort of better way to put that.
Okay. So it's probably clear to people how reconciling yourself to the impermanence of like pleasures and people whom you love, kind of making a peace with that, given that the people are going to die and the pleasure is going to fade, it's probably evident how that could be kind of a therapeutic thing to do. But I gather there's for you more value than that. I mean, in other words, it might not be so obvious to them, but what good is it to do to really, really notice how ephemeral thoughts are? I mean, well, we did talk about one sense of that, but I mean,
and it leads to stages of awakening, which are highly recommended for not necessarily always totally obvious reasons, but let's just say highly recommended. And so even if you don't think that impermanence is so great, as a practical point, if you notice it again and again and again, it can do very, very good things to your brain, assuming you do okay through some of the more difficult stages as your identity construct gets torn down. So
it can do good things to your brain in what sense? Just to notice this kind of internal impermanence does what kind of good? Okay,
so going back to sort of more beginnerish relative things, well, actually, they actually extrapolate well down the path as well. If you're really good at noticing thoughts arising and vanishing very, very rapidly with all their little core syllabalistic components, meaning like you notice that a thought of like, hi, I'm Daniel, is made up of actually all these little, hi, I am Daniel. Like it's got all these little blips to it and nuances and wiggles or whatever it is.
It's granular.
So it's very granular, and each of those are sort of oscillating back and forth with the intentions to create those, the recognition of whether or not they came out created properly.
Okay, but let me just quickly ask you, I mean,
hold on.
What is it that's granular? It's one thing to say that the vocal expression of a thought is granular if you see it closely enough, but
the intentions to think that are equally as granular. So both digital and analog granular. So meaning there's lots of little intentions to think every little part of every little word that you say.
The energy that gives rise to the thought.
The intention. So there's a mental thing, I'm going to say something, and then you say it. And then there's also, as you say it, there are all the little mental impressions of the sounds and the physical sensations of the mouth, oscillating back and forth to say, am I saying this properly? What did I just say? Did the word come out of my mouth properly? And it's also simultaneously setting up to say the next parts and pondering where the whole thing is going. So there's a lot of processing going on, but that's all processing that you can actually see at a sensate level if you get good at this. Again, with a better microscope, or macroscope, depending on how you're going with your attention, you can start to notice all those little proto-intentions that lead to thought, like I'm going to think a thought, or I'm going to, so you actually have an intention to think a thought, and then you think a thought.
Well, I think most people
to say something, and then you say it, and you also, there's this mental thing if you're monitoring the process and planning where it's going, and all of those things are oscillating back and forth very rapidly in experience, and you can actually learn to notice all of those very clearly as individual components of both the physical experience of talking, for example, and of thinking about what you're going to say and all that stuff.
Of course, the first thing is to notice, before you break the intention down into its granules, is to notice that there's an intention to begin with, which a lot of, I don't think I would have, which people would not normally do. That itself is a meditative attainment, right?
That is. That's cause and effect. So when we get from the first attainment of, thoughts are thoughts, that's called mind and body. When you actually see thoughts, they break off and see, those are thoughts. The next stage of practice is cause and effect, where you start to notice, I intend to think, and then a thought arises. I hear a sensation. I hear a sound, and then I make a mental impression of that sound that I can remember. Or I see an image, and then I remember something about that image. Or I decide to, sniffle, and then I sniffle. And then I noticed I was sniffling, and I made a mental impression of that. And then I thought about the mental impression of the sniffle or whatever. Okay. And so you can start to notice that there's this amazing richness to our experience that we actually are using all the time to do practical stuff, but we're only a little bit aware of it. There's not a high degree of awareness of it. And bringing up the awareness of that actually shows you a ton of stuff about your mind, your brain, your sense of identity, who you are, but it also provides great insight into the granular transience of those things. So when suddenly all those things that seem like this huge deal are instead this very fine-grained, ephemeral, sort of rich, intricate, scintillating, fascinating thing, that really is a very different experience from, I'm like suffering.
Yeah. So there's a little bit, it seems to be a little bit of a tension here. This will be a good segue to not self. So, I mean, we've talked about impermanence, and we've talked about, what was the dukkha, or suffering. The third mark of existence is not self. And it seems there's a little tension here, because one thing you actually commonly hear, I mean, you just said you have the intention to think, but it isn't just that I'm pointing out, that you use the word you. We all have to use the word you and I as a conventional matter, but what you commonly hear with many meditation teachers at many meditation retreats, I think, is like, thoughts think themselves, or if you pay attention, you'll notice these thoughts just drift by. They just come from nowhere. So the idea isn't that there was an intention that originated with you. Now,
the intention is also a thought. So intention falls into the category of thought. There's an intention to think, and then the thought, and then the mental impression of the thought, all of which fall into the category of thought. So when they're saying thought, in a broad category, they also include intentions, they include mental impressions, they include memories, and they include all the sort of analytical monitoring process as we're going. So like, as I'm moving my hand, I'm also noticing that my hand is moving on the screen, for example, or as I tilt my head, my head's tilted, or whatever it is, right? So there's that monitoring, which the brain is also doing, which is also all in the category of thought. So there's the linear thought stream of, I've got to figure out what to say next because I want to make sure this interview goes well. That's the linear thought stream. But then there are all the intentions, which are also thoughts to think that, and the monitoring of the process as it's going on. So those are all in the broad category of thought. And most people, when they think of thought, they're just thinking about the linear narrative, right? They're thinking about their linear story, their narrative, the linear processing of, what am I going to say next?
Okay. Now, I mean, one thing I've noticed while meditating about thoughts is that there are feelings associated with them. I have, or you could say if you want to, let me use that word. I have feelings about thoughts. I mean, there are, I want to, that thought feels good, that thought feels bad, but I think if you pay close enough attention, you'll see that thoughts pretty much always have some kind of affective coloring.
Yes.
Now, how does that relate to what you've already said?
Well, actually, that's one of the most fascinating topics in meditation of all. And it's because, how can you feel a thought? That's a funny thing, isn't it? You would think that you couldn't feel thoughts. So we can look at this two different ways, neither of which is necessarily always the best way. So we could look at it from the way which says there are thoughts, and then they create related physical feelings. So when you have a thought, some brain chemicals or chemistry or whatever, presumably, creates a sense of some sensations in the body somewhere that are either pleasant, unpleasant, or neutral, right? So when we feel sadness, we feel it usually down here or in our stomach, or, we may feel fear in our throat or whatever, or we may feel joy sort of welling up through us. We're not exactly sure where it's welling up from, but it's kind of all over the place. Or we may, feel other sensations like that, apprehension, and the whole body contracts, right? There's this clear and incredibly intricate, rich dynamic between thoughts and physical sensations. So that's one way to look at it. Mm-hmm. And all feelings obviously have, basically by their nature, they've got these physical components, right? It's this complicated and intricate, interesting interaction between like how our body feels when we, think certain thoughts or have certain images arise. Oh, sorry about that.
That's okay.
Sorry about the phone call. Oh, there you go. Good. And that's, or we could take another point of view, like, are dreams mental? Maybe dreams are a mentally created thing, right? So if we take the dream world as to gain some insights into thought, we can feel physical sensations in dreams. So it may be that thoughts actually have physical components to them, or mm-hmm. physical tangibility, which is really another interesting and profound insight that you can gain from meditation and start noticing, wait, thoughts manifest physically. They're almost like noise on the physical body.
You can feel their impact on your body. And that presumably
thoughts actually have physical components to them, which is actually a very important thing. So you could actually say maybe pleasure is in some ways in the thoughts, or maybe they're a sort of a unified thing that splitting them up that way, it doesn't help. So at certain stages of practice, it may not be useful to split them up separately, but to notice them as this sort of flowing, fluid dynamic of causal elements.
Yeah. Well, I would think that, surely thoughts have physical incarnation in the sense that there is something going on somewhere in your brain when you have one, some actual synapses firing. But in terms of feeling their tangibility, feeling their presence, they're bumping up against your body in some sense of various ways. I would think that would have a lot to do with the affective coloring of the thought. That's one of the things you're feeling, right?
So you're clearly feeling the physical stuff, but the thoughts themselves actually have physical components to them, which is a very strange thing to say, and that starts to blur the sense doors, right? So meditators often start to notice these sort of synesthetic elements, where sense doors aren't always as totally perfectly segregated as we generally think they are.
So the classic case of that is when different numbers have different colors. Is that the classic case of synesthesia? Like when someone, there are people who have something called synesthesia, right? And that's yes. like, is that the deal? Like whenever they think of 7, they think of blue, or?
No, synesthesia would be like that they feel sights, or they see sounds, or whatever, which it turns out all of the sense doors in all people do this to a teeny little degree, right? So when we hear a sound, we mm-hmm. also create an image that somehow is related to that sound, and we also geolocate it in our brain in a sort of a mental space. So if you heard a sound behind you of someone clapping, instantly there are going to be a bunch of visual sensations that are going to sort of co-arise with that sound of someone clapping behind you that put it into a three-dimensional visual frame of where you think that sound is, mm-hmm. what you think it was, and what it implies for you. So there's going to be this cascade of physical things, of visual things, along with the auditory thing. Mm-hmm. And actually, that's one of the fascinating things about meditation, is noticing all these little intricate cross connections that show how our brain actually processes stuff, which is to subtly mingle sense doors and have things relate to each other, which is why thoughts can be painful, or mm-hmm. why sounds can be pleasurable or painful, or why sights can cause us duress, or how we can, there are subtle physical aspects to thought. Like if I want to reach out and touch something, you can actually watch the process by which the brain modeled in 3D what it expected to feel and when it expected to feel it as the hand reaches towards an object it's about to touch. Mm-hmm. And you can actually notice that anticipatory process and all the cool things about how thought actually models physical stuff, which actually has real physical components to it, which are outside of where you are. So for example, when I've got this glass here, for example, and I want to reach my hand over to it, even before I touch it, my hand is anticipating feeling things, but where that anticipatory thing of feeling them as happening is actually where the glass is, where you wouldn't think I could actually feel anything. There's subtle aspects of thought that actually you notice actually have physical components here where my body clearly is not. So the brain does all these cool things, and you can start to notice all those little intricacies in meditation, and they're actually important. They seem like subtle or trivial, but it turns out that getting to know those actually helps you see a lot about feelings, about emotions, because thought is subtle stuff, and yet it's incredibly powerful.
Right.
And so if you can't notice all these subtleties about thought, then even though it's very experientially subtle, it will have a lot of power that you don't understand why it's having that power.
Yeah.
And so you can, anyway, and those are also powerful effects that can be utilized skillfully later on. So when you actually learn to have some control over the stuff and learn to have more mastery of your mind by thinking specific thoughts or by tuning attention in specific ways, you can then cause all these outrageously cool physical, visual, auditory effects, which are very powerful based on just thought.
So, perhaps related to what you just said about the glass, on my last meditation retreat, there was a moment when I was meditating in my room. There was rain outside, and for a little while, it seemed like my awareness of the rain was where the rain was.
Nice. That is a key insight.
Well, yeah, but then it faded, and then I thought, how do I know I wasn't just being a crazy person at that moment? And that's my question to you, is like...
Well, that's actually the scientific model. So here's the weird thing about the scientific model of the brain.
Yeah.
The scientific model of the brain says this is all a sort of a highly artificial, put together, highly processed, three-dimensional construct in a brain somewhere.
Right.
Where that brain is, we're not exactly sure. That becomes philosophically very problematic.
Wait, what do you mean by that? I mean, most people feel pretty confident that their brain is inside their heads.
Unless you understand the scientific model.
Well, in other words, there's information that is input for the brain, and in that sense, part of the brain's own information processing that is outside of the brain. Is that what you're saying?
No. Okay. What I'm saying is this is basically a hologram constructed in a brain somewhere. All of it. That's what the scientific model says, right? All of this is a hologram in a brain somewhere. It clearly is not this brain I think is here, because these are experiences. Atoms don't have experiences. That doesn't make any sense. Molecules don't have experiences. They're not conscious things we don't think. So when we talk about a sort of materialist perspective on the reality, we forget the fact that we are modeling a material reality with and hyper-processing it in all these elaborate ways that, you can show how we process visual stuff and how we process auditory stuff and tactile stuff to come up with something that clearly is none of those things from a materialist point of view. So the entire sphere of experience is the construct in a brain somewhere. That's what science says, weirdly enough. I mean, that's the scientific model.
Why do you keep saying a brain somewhere rather than in my brain?
Well, but where? So this is the construct in the brain. Where's the brain?
I don't think it matters how many times I point to my head and say it's in here. I don't think that's going to sway you. But it's what most people would say. I mean, why are you so? What do you mean when you say there's a brain somewhere else?
Well, it's not this brain. This is the construct, right? So there's no red from a material.
Well, okay. I mean, are we distinguishing? Is this the mind-body issue? I mean, are we distinguishing?
Yeah.
We're distinguishing between subjective experience, which all of this awareness is.
All colors are a hyper-processed subjective experience. From a sort of materialist point of view, there's just frequencies of oscillating photons at some energy, level or whatever. But red is not a material thing. Neither is sound.
Right. Subjective experience.
Neither are tastes. It's not like these things actually taste like that. That taste is a hyper-processed construct.
Yeah, no, I get that.
But the entire thing is that. And
I get that.
The entire thing is that. It's not strange to be having thoughts here or notice that the rain is experienced where the rain is, because of course that's where the rain is being experienced. That's where the brain's creating the images.
Well, no, I mean, the conventional view is the rain is being experienced where the sound waves initiated by the rain hit your brain.
Yeah, but this isn't the brain it's hitting. It's hitting a brain somewhere, but not this one.
Well, okay, but here we're getting to a point of a point that is not universally accepted. I mean, Like, I mean, let me just say, like, your point about, hey, the experience of red is not a physical thing, that is a fairly widely accepted point, that there's this distinction between subjective experience and what we think of as the physical world. A lot of people, I accept that distinction, but
only from a materialist point of view. So you could go totally the other way, and you could say, this is the foundation of experience, is the sensate world, from which we extrapolate all these materialist conceptions that we can't actually experience.
So you could, in other words, you could say consciousness is more fundamental than the physical world.
Well, that's an old debate. But,
right.
But from a Vipassana point of view, this happens to be darn useful and very empowering, regardless of any questions of ultimate truth.
Okay, but you acknowledge that the conventional view among people who grant the distinction between the kind of seemingly immaterial subjective world of subjective experience and the material world, the conventional view is that the subjective experience gets generated in this physical brain. I mean, you almost act as if you're surprised that I hold that view, but that's what people think. Well, why?
Right, and it was very bizarre. So it's interesting. So you hold one view of this construct until you get right here, and then you adopt a totally different view, except that view would change. So, for instance, is this me? Well, if I cut off my fingernail, suddenly that's not me, and it becomes not me, but then it was me. So we do this bizarre dance where we're constantly drawing this line. So you're saying, this is not real. This is all the construct until you get to right here, and suddenly the sense of constructedness ends, which is not a strict interpretation of the modeling function of a brain. So it would say this is also construct as much as right here is. So you would say construct, not construct, not construct, right? Except that, no, all construct from a materialist point of view.
Okay.
But the real, so materialists would say the real stuff is out there. It's all inferred, implied, it's wavicles, it's Schrodinger equations, it's particles and bosons and all this stuff, none of which have any consciousness. But then the constructed image in a brain somewhere is all of this, including this skin, this skull, which would all be constructs in the brain.
Okay, so are you kind of saying like...
Anyway.
Are you kind of saying like it's fairly conventional to accept... I mean, to get back to the British empiricists, and the extreme version of them, one direction that's taken is so-called idealism. Like Berkeley says, well, wait, for all we know, we're in the Matrix. For all we know, nothing out there is real, and because you know, it's all just information like impinging on us, and all we know is the point of impingement. We don't know if it's really out there. And you're kind of saying that's also true of everything you think of as being in here, right? I mean,
that's right. That's unfalsifiable is the problem. So the problem with solipsism, as the philosophers again and again gnash their teeth at, is it's not falsifiable. People have tried and said, "Oh, I've debunked solipsism." Yeah, good luck with that. You can find things that seem to imply a debunking of solipsism, but you can't actually rigorously, totally tear it down.
Okay,
which is an important point. So, like, empiricism is hard to argue against within the framework of empiricism.
Right. So, just to put
but from a more bringing it back to practice, which is what I care about.
Right.
The empirical point of view that all of this is just sensate stuff is actually incredibly useful for insight practice because noticing just the raw material of experience again and again and again does something good, regardless of all these abstract philosophical or physiological or materialist or non-materialist or solipsistic or existentialist implications. Practically, my core philosophy is pragmatism, even more than it is empiricism. And so I care that if you actually take this framework and you actually notice these are thoughts, these are physical sensations, they change radically and shift all the time, they oscillate, flux, and do this, that can do really cool stuff.
Okay.
And make beneficial changes that make it a heck of a lot easier to navigate and be in this life.
Okay. We've been doing this an hour, so I'm afraid we'll have to sign up. But first, I do want to just revisit this slightly and make sure I understand it. So, like, you again, it's common to say, well, how was I going to rephrase it? I mean, I've already said it once, and maybe that's enough. But the point is, like, we think all we know, all we know for sure, that curtain out there, all I actually can say with confidence is like there are light rays impinging on my eyeball that blah, blah, blah. And then you're saying you can't even say that in a way, right? Because...
Okay, it depends on your frame and what you're trying to do. I'm a pragmatist more than I am a dogmatist, right?
Right.
If you're trying to set up lenses and some photographic experiment or a telescope, or you're trying to get the correct type of glasses, then that framework of looking at reality becomes really important because you want the correct curvature of the lens for the photons and whatever. But you're not experiencing photons, you're experiencing colors.
Yeah.
Right? You think you're experiencing photons. No, you're seeing, from a certain point of view you are, but you actually see colors. You don't see them as photons. Okay, the dark adjusted eye can see a single photon, but what it sees is actually a color, not some elaborate wavical, process that suddenly gelled when it was measured or something. You see what I mean?
So yeah, I see your point. And I know you want to keep it pragmatic, but you're also saying that if you follow this logic far enough, it becomes a metaphysical point, and it raises ultimately the question about it leads to the question of which is more fundamental, consciousness or physical. So, in other words,
but you don't actually have to go there. Yeah. You could just, as a practitioner of Vipassana, when doing Vipassana, notice your sensate experience. But notice that really, really, really well again and again and again. And that rewires it where it feels like, can't prove it definitively, but, get some plenty of hints that this may be going, it does seem to rewire some brain somewhere to make how we process this life and how we live this life better. So, as a process of general improvement, a better relationship to our sensate existence, which is the existence that is important,
Well, I guess what I still don't get is why you confidently refer to a brain somewhere that's not the one in my head. I take the point. It's interesting that you follow the logic far enough, and it's like, well, wait a second. Not only is what's being perceived out there, but like, is there something in here doing the perceiving? Because everything I think of as me is actually
just perception.
It's just manifesting itself. And so I get all that. I just don't know why you think there has to be some giant brain out there.
There doesn't, actually. It doesn't have to be a giant brain out there, but it does. Those are they're sort of two totally different considerations, right? Okay. There's the neuroscientific, like, is there a brain somewhere? Where's the brain? What's the brain? How does all that work? That's sort of a hard question of consciousness. What's the wiring, and how do we measure that? And how can we extrapolate data points from this sensate experience that tell us more about that? So that's sort of the scientific question. But the practical question as a practitioner is, what happens when I get really good at being really clear about all these little intricate, fine, oscillating sensations of mind and body, or however you want to differentiate them? And what happens when I do that well, using good techniques or whatever methods you prefer, and the effects are good, and that's important. And the degree to which that can get more clear and produce beneficial changes is vastly more than most people suspect. And so highly, highly worth training well in from my point of view, so that all of this makes straightforward sense to you, the watcher, rather than any speculations about some realization of some dude with funny headphones on his head, right? That's not so interesting if it doesn't impact your life.
It is supposed to be practically useful. And you're a meditation teacher, right? You teach.
Sure.
So people, and where can people find ways to, you have this Dharma Overground site, right?
Mm-hmm.
That's one place. I guess that's a place to contact your whole phenomenon, right?
That's a great place, yeah. And the nice thing about that is it's more distributed and egalitarian, so there's a whole bunch of different people there with great wisdom to share. And, like any internet forum, it has its internet forum, range. Just realize that when you go there. But there is a great sort of moving, but, fluid, but still, relatively well-established group of people there who can really help people to practice well, to help refer them to other good places to practice, to help, interpret experience through some filters that can be helpful, and to help normalize things, and to help provide the camaraderie that makes this process so much more fun.
Okay.
So
interested people should go to Dharma Overground. Your book is Mastering the Core Teachings of the Buddha. And just to recap, like I would, we never get as far in a good conversation as you would hope, because there's so many interesting things to stop and talk about. And we haven't gotten much into the practical implications or progress down the path per se. But let me recap what I think we've achieved this time, and then maybe we can talk about the other stuff on another occasion. First of all, there is a kind of a systematic path, a meditative path within the Vipassana tradition, and it doesn't just involve like feeling better and better. It's like the idea is that you are actually apprehending reality more clearly in some very subtle senses, And the claim is that these three things we've spent at least some time on, mainly we spent time on impermanence and dukkha, or suffering. We spent a lot of time on not self last time. But the final thing I'd say is that this thing on your title page where it says that the book is by the interdependent universe, that gets at a couple of things, but one of it kind of gets at the not self idea, because part of not self is a recognition that what we think of as a discrete person is actually in constant interplay with causes and so on, and it's not a self-sufficient being. It is a product of influences, and it in turn influences things, and the flux is going on all the time. So everything I do is due to all kinds of people and things, and yes. I don't deserve all the credit, but I'm willing to accept it. But I'm willing to accept it if people insist.
Yeah, it is totally absurd. I mean, the number of causes, the conditions that led to the book are, gigantic and beginningless as far as we can tell, probably. So, so thanks to all my teachers, thanks to all the people who help support practice, and parents and family, and everyone who helped with monasteries and the meditation centers, and everything else along the way that led to that book arising. So anyway,
all any of us do is mediate influence. And congratulations on doing a good job of that so far, apparently, Daniel. And maybe we'll talk down the road. Thanks a lot.
Fun stuff.
Yep.